Hola camaradas. So YouTube came out with a new feature, quizzes, and I took this to be a personal challenge. So I decided I was going to make a course, and I have 11 years experience learning Spanish and quite a bit of experience teaching Spanish. So we're going to start making Spanish course. And today's Friday. Friday is my Spanish day. So we're going to start off today with pronunciation. So this video is going to be a guide of how to get what I like to think of as intermediate pronunciation. So we have beginner pronunciation. This is when you can, you're trying to pronounce Spanish and it's hard for the other person to understand you. And we have advanced pronunciation where you sound like a native speaker. So personally, I think advanced pronunciation, I think talking like a native speaker in another language isn't really necessary, it's really hard, and it's more than I can teach you in a video. It's more than I've accomplished myself, because I simply don't want to put that much effort into sounding like something I'm not. I'm fine having an accent. I care about being understood and being able to understand people without any difficulty. So we're going to go over some of the things that you need to know to be able to pronounce Spanish in such a way that you will be understood easily, and some things that aren't 100% necessary but can get you a little bit better, a little more natural sounding, and can also better prepare you to be able to understand Spanish. Because if you don't know what to listen for, you won't be able to understand it. So learning pronunciation, a little bit of phonology, will be able to help you understand Spanish as well. And I think this is something that's really overlooked when people talk about learning about the pronunciation of another language. So we're going to start off with the vowels. So Spanish has a really simple vowel system. We have 5 vowels. And you might be thinking, Liam, we have 5 vowels in English as well. No, we don't. We have 5 vowel letters. But we have way more vowel sounds. If we look at the letter A in English, it can make the A sound, it can make the A sound, it can make the A sound, like in the first syllable in pasta, but it can also make the sound, like the last A in pasta. So that's like 4 sounds off the top of my head for one letter. In Spanish, the A sound, in Spanish, the letter A makes the A sound. And the letter is called A. So in Spanish, when you say pasta, you don't say pasta, you say pasta. And you maintain the A sound, pasta. So you don't do what we call reducing the vowel. In English, we reduce vowel. That means when a word has more than one syllable, we pronounce the vowel sound really clearly in the syllable that has the accent, the syllable that's a little bit stronger. But with the other syllables, we kind of gloss over it a little bit. We make it sound weaker and it blends in. And that's part of the reason we have so many vowel sounds in English compared to Spanish. So next up we have E. So E is the sound the letter E makes. In Spanish it's E, it makes the E sound. And this brings us into another problem a lot of English speakers have when we try and pronounce Spanish. A lot of times we don't really have pure vowel sounds in English. We have what are called diphthongs, where we begin at one vowel sound and we end at another. And this is a great example. We have the word day, A. In the sound you can hear it change, A, but in Spanish it's just E. So if someone says Dia de los Muertos, a lot of times in English we might say Dia de los Muertos. So it'd be like Dia de los Muertos, and you get that day, which is really kind of elongated. We don't want to do that. And this is one of those things where it's not a big deal if you mess it up. You'll have an accent, which is fine. It's just really good to know what to listen for, what to understand. Next up we have E. So this E, in English we call it I, makes the E sound. And so I think this isn't a sound that is particularly hard to make. One of the things I would caution is that a lot of times when we have a word that exists in both Spanish and English, or very similar words, especially if it's a long word, we'll be a little tempted to pronounce it like we do in English, even if we don't notice. We'll pronounce something like interesante as interesante, and we'll kind of weaken that E sound into an E. E does not exist in Spanish. So if we want to have good pronunciation, we have to maintain what I think of as like a strong E, and really watch out for those longer words where it can be, easy to slip into a bad habit, especially if we're already used to pronouncing it in a more kind of Anglo way. Next up we have O. O makes the O sound. And so you might think you already have this. It's like O, like in goat. But it's not quite that, because this is another case where we really have a lot of diphthongs in English. So if we look at a word like taco, in English we say taco, taco, O. It's a diphthong, O. but in Spanish it's like taco, taco. The O, it ends. It doesn't change. It's just O. Next up we have U. I think U is pretty self-explanatory. Sometimes in English we'll add a U sound at the beginning of U. So instead of saying university, we say university. Instead of saying cube, we say cube. Instead of saying Cuba, we say Cuba. And so we don't do that in Spanish. And so you look out for that, but I think in general it's not too difficult. Next up we have Y. This is Y. So in English we say that Y is sometimes a vowel, sometimes a consonant. In Spanish phonology, it's more thought of as always a vowel. And in those cases where it makes the glide, the Y sound, they don't really think of that as a separate consonant. They think of that sound together as a diphthong, which is just kind of a slightly different way of conceptualizing the same thing. It's more of an advanced topic, unless you're talking about linguistics, it probably won't come up, so don't really worry about it. The Y makes the Y sound, it can make the E sound, just like in the letter E, but to a lot of Spanish speakers, they don't really see the difference. They think it's just a diphthong. But we should be aware that Y sound will change depending on the region. So in a lot of places, it's like a softer Y sound like we have in English. But in places like northern Mexico, it might be a Y sound, como me llamo. And in Argentina, actually, it can go all the way to a sh sound. Yo me llamo. We should also mention the double L here. So in Spanish, there's a double L. So when L comes twice together, historically it's pronounced like ya. Like in Italian GL or Portuguese LH, or even in like the English word million. So it's like a L with like a Y sound after. But that pronunciation is pretty much dying out. There are a few corners which you might hear it in modern day Spanish, but for the most part, it's going to be pronounced like a Y. So however someone pronounces a Y in their native accent, whether it be ya, ja, or sha, that's probably how they're going to pronounce the double L as well, and that's probably what you should do. Okay, and now we can move on to consonants. We have be. So be by itself is not super interesting thing where when it comes between two vowels, it's a weak sound where your lips don't fully touch. In English, we have the nickname Abe. And if we were to pronounce this, in Spanish, like it were a nickname for Abelardo, it would be Ave. And so your lips don't quite touch. You don't have to do this. If you don't do this, people won't have a problem understanding you. But you, if you aren't aware of this, might have a problem understanding them. So be aware of this. It's related to this kind of broader concept of a phoneme and an allophone. So the quick version of this is that a phoneme is a group of sounds that native speakers identify with each other. And an allophone is a specific variation of that sound. So an example of this in English is I went to school in a town called New Britain, and that's how we pronounced it, New Britain. But a lot of Americans would say New Britain, New Britain, and they thought we weren't pronouncing the T because we had a glottal stop, New Britain, New Britain. But you'll notice that a lot of other native English speakers wouldn't say New Britain either. They'd say New Britain. And so we already have right there 3 different pronunciations of the letter T in English. And each variation is an allophone of the phoneme T. We're recognizing each sound is a member of that same sound, even if it sounds slightly different. And so is a non-native speaker aiming for kind of this intermediate pronunciation? That's what you want to get. You want to get to the point where you can pronounce something recognizable as a phoneme for each of the Spanish phonemes, even if it's kind of an unnatural allophone. So the ave, that pronunciation is an allophone of be. And so if you mess it up, they will understand you, but you should be aware of it to understand them. Another thing we should be aware of is that V doesn't really exist. We have this letter, B corta, and B corta, or V, is pronounced exactly the same is be. So a lot of times if someone has a spelling mistake, it might just be because of this mismatch where these two things are written separately for historical reasons, but now they're pronounced the same. So you might get haber and haber are pronounced exactly the same way. And so someone might spell one when they want to spell the other. Similarly to how we have there, and there in English, and when texting, someone might mix those up. And V behaves exactly the same as be. When it comes between two vowels, it becomes a V sound, like uve. Next up, we have the letter C. So we're gonna start with the word like comer, which means to eat, and we're gonna play a fun game. We're going to put our hand in front of our mouth, and we're gonna say comer. Now, you might feel a puff of air when you say that, comer. You don't want to feel that puff, comer. How we can play around with this in English is in English we have the phoneme k, and it comes with that puff of air, but we do have an allophone of this without the puff of air. So if you say kin, you'll have that puff of air probably, but if you use the allophone of the k sound that we use in skin, you won't feel a puff. So you want to practice using the sk sound without the s and go comer. We can also practice with the word taco. I like this because it exists both in English and in Spanish, so we can really kind of play around with the pronunciation between taco and taco. And ideally, you shouldn't have a puff of air for the T or the C. Taco. Because we don't pronounce the T with a puff of air either in Spanish. Taco. Tomar. Not taco. Tomar. Another thing, this is more of an advanced thing, so if you don't want to deal with this at the moment, it's not a huge issue. People will still understand you perfectly. When you pronounce the T in Spanish, it actually, your tongue position will be slightly different. In English, it's right behind your teeth, like toe. But in Spanish, you actually do it on your teeth, taco. And this is a really good thing to be aware of, because you'll notice that T in English has that puff of air, but D doesn't have the same puff of air. So a lot of times English speakers struggle with this. When someone was pronouncing a T in Spanish, because there's no puff of air, they'll hear a D, because one of the cues we look for as English speakers to determine whether something's a T or a D isn't just whether it's voiced, whether you have the vocal cords activated, but also whether it's aspirated, whether you have that puff of air. So that's a really important thing to look out for and get used to. This will also come up with the letter P, like P. So we don't say pueblo, we say pueblo. We don't say popular, we say popular. And so you can just put your hand in front of your mouth and pronounce these words popular, popular, and just compare, see whether you have that puff of air. So next up we have G, G, and so G makes the G sound like in gota, which means drop, gota. It's pretty similar in English, but when it comes before an I or E, a lot of times in English it makes the J sound, but in Spanish it always makes the H sound in like gemelo. So what do you do if you want to be able to pronounce something like gay? Well, this is more of a spelling thing than a pronunciation thing. What you do to maintain the hard G sound before I or E is you put a U, it's a silent U, just a spelling convention, between the I or the E and the G. So to say guitar, we say guitar. Now you might be wondering what happens if you want to pronounce the U. We put these two little dots above the letter U. It's called a diaresis. Don't get it confused with umlaut in German. That's a different thing. And so these two dots just let us know that we pronounce the U. So we have pinguino, and it's pinguino and not pinguino. We actually used to have this in English. I think the New Yorker still uses it. So whenever we would want to emphasize that you pronounce a letter, like in cooperate, we'd put the little diaresis above the second O to make sure we don't pronounce it like cooperate. While we're on the subject, we should also mention the letter J. So this is J. So in English it makes the J sound like G, but in Spanish it makes the J sound like in G. And so what I always think of is we have jalapeno, not jalapeno. And so it's kind of like a H sound in English, but it comes from a little further back like a H sound. And in some accents it might be a little stronger than others. So I think in like Mexican Spanish it's a little weaker. But in Spanish Spanish it's just a little bit stronger. We should also talk about the letter H. You don't pronounce it. H is a historical marker in Spanish, where there used to be an aspiration, a H sound that is no longer pronounced, except in very few accents. You know, you can live your entire life as a Spanish speaker, and like I've talked to people about this who, you know, have lived their entire lives in like a Spanish speaking country, consuming Spanish speaking media, and have never come across someone who pronounces the H. I think it only ever happens in very few Caribbean accents and very few Southern Spain accents, and often it's to emphasize the word. A lot of times before it's an aspiration, like a H sound, it was what we call a sibilant sound, like a hissing sound, like an S or an F. So if you look at a word that begins with H in Spanish, a lot of times you can trace it to a related word that has an F or an S. So, for instance, the word horno in Spanish means oven, but if you know what pasta al forno is, if you know that's pasta at the oven, in Italian, you know forno and orno are related words. It's just Italian maintained the F sound, whereas Spanish turned it into an H. If you know some Portuguese, this will come in handy as well, or if you know a little bit of Latin. And so we have the word hierro in Spanish, hierro, and so that comes from the Latin word ferros, or ferrum, and so that was an F. So that H used to be an F, and that's why even in the periodic table today, the symbol for iron is F. Okay, we also have R, R, and so this is a complicated one for a lot of English speakers. If you're familiar with American English and how we pronounce the middle T in water, that's the same kind of sound you want to make in that T. We don't really pronounce it like a T. It's an alveolar flap. That means that ridge behind your teeth is where your tongue is going to be, and it's just going to lightly tap it. R, R. But to make it a double R, 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 we just hold it there for a little longer and we let it kind of flap against it a lot. It's a little hard to explain, but if you experiment a bit, it's not that hard to get. I know a lot of people think they can't roll their R's, but pretty much everyone with a bit of practice can learn. And so the spelling convention for this is a little weird. A lot of people think, oh, every time it's a single R, you pronounce it like the small, like R, like pero, which means but. And every time there's a double R, like perro, like dog, you pronounce it double. But the single R is pronounced as a double R when it's the first letter of a word. So a great example of this is ropa. We don't say ropa, we say ropa. And so when we have, this means clothes, by the way. So we have a guardarropa, which guards the clothes, or is like a dresser. It's spelled with a double R, and that's just a spelling difference. It's not a pronunciation difference because it's now no longer the first letter in the word. Also, when it's the first letter in a syllable directly followed by a consonant, I know that sounds a little weird, but if you think of the name Enrique, we pronounce this as a double R as well. So we're going to go back to our concept of phonemes for a bit, because in English we don't have the R, and we don't have the R. So it can be a little hard for English speakers to hear the difference between these two. And you might have been wondering how you can tell if something's a phoneme or if it's an allophone of something. So there's a way to test for this. It's called a minimal pair. And a minimal pair is when we have two words that differ by one sound. And if we can correctly identify these as two separate words, it means that because the sound is the only difference, it has to be meaningful. So an example of this in English is bat is one word, and if I say bat, you as an English speaker will understand that I'm referring to a baseball bat, or maybe like the animal that flies. But if I say pat with a P, you'll know this is a different word, like I'm patting a dog. And because the only difference is the B and the P, we know that they're two separate letters from each other. They're two separate sounds, they're two separate phonemes. And so we're going to use this to our advantage when learning new sounds in another language. If we have trouble hearing the difference between two sounds, like the single R and the double R, we're going to find a word or a pair of words that differ only by this one letter. So we have pero, but, and perro, dog. And so you should, if you can find audio recordings of people saying these words, or if you can practice with another person, that'd be great, and just try and correctly identify which one is which to begin with, and then try and mimic that. It'll go a long way to making your Spanish comprehension all that much better. Next up we have S. S by itself is not super interesting. It makes the S sound, but a lot of Spanish speakers particularly in the south of Spain, in the Caribbean, in Central America, and certain parts of South America, they don't fully pronounce it. They aspirate it. If it's at the end of the syllable, that is. So instead of saying español, they might say español. Or they might even delete it altogether and say español. So if you're looking to understand people from the Caribbean, people from Central America, this is a very important thing to understand. We have like textbook Spanish, but the truth is nobody really speaks that way in their day-to-day life. So you gotta understand that people aren't gonna speak like they do in a textbook, and that's okay. We have to accept that. We have to embrace that, and we have to learn to understand that. And if you really want to get into an advanced accent and like you want to sound like you're from the Dominican Republic or something, you got to learn how to mimic it as well. We should also mention Z. A lot of English speakers will have trouble with this. They'll pronounce it like a Z sound. It's never pronounced like a Z sound. In Latin America, it is pronounced the same way as S. So corazón and not corazón. Razón, not razón. But in Spain, they pronounce it like a TH. Razón, which is kind of a funny sound in a lot of languages. It's not very common, the TH sound. There are two of them in English. We have the, which is voiced, and the, which is unvoiced. I don't think we have any minimal pairs between these two, but people can learn to hear the difference and they make the difference. So they're kind of two allophones. And in a lot of places in Spanish, you get the other one as well. So when the D comes between two vowels, because the tongue is already in the TH position, already on the teeth, instead of saying cada, for instance, you might say cada, and it just becomes a fricative. It becomes that voiced TH sound. So be aware of that. Be aware of that for pronunciation when you're reading out loud, when you're learning new words. When you see a Z, if you're trying to learn Latin American Spanish, remember this is an S. And if you want to learn Spain Spanish, this is a TH. Finally, we have X. So X is a funny letter. It represented a couple of different sounds, one of which was sh, which no longer exists. So Mexico used to be Mexico, and in the indigenous language Nahuatl, where the word Mexico comes from, they still pronounce it as a sh, so they'll still say like Mexico. But in modern Spanish, that sound no longer exists, and it became a ch. So that's why in English we write Don Quixote with an X, but in Spanish it became a ch, they write it with a J now. But Mexico, still written with an X, but we pronounce it like a ch. But most of the time, X is probably going to be pronounced like a xa, like in English. So existir. But you might want to look it up. If you see a new word with an X, you might just want to verify the pronunciation. Depending on its origin, it might be a little bit funny. So if you learn all of this, if you practice it, I would, write down like 3 of these things that you want to work at a time and find a text. If you can find someone who can correct you, that would be great. Or you can just record yourself and just try and read through a paragraph or 2 in Spanish and really focus on getting all of these, like all the 3 things you wrote down, whatever you want to work on, until you feel confident in pronouncing all of the letters correctly in each circumstance. I think that will go a long way to getting you a good pronunciation. Next up, we'll talk some about the rule of accentuation, which a lot of people overlook, but it's super important. It's a fun one. And if you can have someone else who can correct your pronunciation, that's all the better. If you are really gung-ho about learning to sound like a native speaker, you shouldn't be practicing just with me. You should find a bunch of native speakers from one place and try and learn to talk like them. And you should pay attention to their gender, because gender might affect how they talk. Pay attention to, as I said, where they're from, their socioeconomic status, their level of education. All of these things might affect their accent, and there are things you should be aware of as you try and, if you really want to try and cultivate an accent to sound like you come from a specific place. And pay attention to their word choice. So it is super important to learn where certain words are used, especially with slang, and then pay attention to someone's reaction to that. Because if you try and incorporate slang, some people from some cultures might be very receptive to that, and some people from some other cultures might be a little less happy to hear like foreigners using their slang. They might say it sounds, kind of cringy or weird, or they might kind of look down on their own slang. So try and understand the kind of the cultural circumstances within each country. Remember, Spanish speakers are not a monolith. There's a very diverse set of places where Spanish is spoken. We have a lot of different conceptions around slang, around different accents, around foreigners learning their language and how. So just pay attention to the reaction you get, especially also with bad words. I would caution you against using region-specific bad words for a long time, because if you don't know the language really well, you don't understand how strong they might be. And so a lot of times people will learn another language and just start using bad words because it's funny. Like, that can work out. There are people, if someone's using bad words with you, you can go ahead and use them with that other person as well. But you should be aware that you might not have a full grasp of just how bad the words you are. Remember, just try and, learn how to function within a different language respectfully. Y buenas noches, buenos días, buena patata.